Big Bad Wolf is one of the most iconic figures in fairy tale history. Whether he's stalking Little Red Riding Hood and her grandmother, or quite literally blowing down the houses of the Three Little Pigs, the Big Bad Wolf is a symbol of unchecked violence, selfishness, and cruelty. He's a character defined almost entirely by the harm he causes. And that's why Bigby Wolf is so fascinating. In The Wolf Among Us, Bigby is forced to live with the weight of that history. He isn't just haunted by vague past mistakes. Rather, he's haunted by a very specific identity. Everyone around him knows who he used to be, and no matter how hard he tries to change, that legacy follows him everywhere. Bigby exists in constant contradiction. He's the sheriff and enforcer of law and order, who's also tasked with keeping Fabletown safe. Yet, at the same time, he's violent, still volatile, and still capable of becoming the monster people fear. Yet, beneath that brutality is somebody who's deeply sympathetic, someone who genuinely cares about the people he's meant to protect, even while working within the establishment that often limits how much good he can actually do. The Wolf Among Us is ultimately a story about change, and about whether somebody can outgrow who they were, and more importantly, whether the world will actually ever let them. And that story simply doesn't work without a protagonist as layered and conflicted as Bigby Wolf. His struggle with the past, the present, and the person he wants to become is the emotional core of the entire game. We can trace Bigby's character and his growth across the story through 4 key scenes, and the first one sets the tone for everything that follows. The opening scene in The Wolf Among Us is one of the strongest character establishing sequences I've seen in almost any game. Before Bigby even speaks, the game is already trying to tell us who he is. We first see him sitting in a car, bathed in moody lighting as police lights flash from blue, then red across his face. That contrast is deliberate. Blue and red are typically seen as good and bad, law and violence, 2 sides of the same coin, or in this case, person. From the very first frame, the game is visually communicating the internal conflict that defines Bigby Wolf. When Bigby arrives to the apartment building, his first interaction is with Toad, and this immediately establishes his role as an enforcer. Bigby tells Toad he needs him to get his glamour, and that's because those are the rules. And Bigby's job is to ultimately enforce those rules. But the scene doesn't actually stop there. It also shows the cost of the enforcement that Bigby does. Toad is unfortunately very poor. He can't afford glamour for himself, let alone his kids. And by enforcing that law without flexibility, Bigby is actively harming the people at the bottom of Fabletown's hierarchy. Which makes this even more important is what happens after Bigby walks upstairs. Toad quietly curses him, not just as a person, but as a symbol of the system that refuses to help those at the bottom. And when Toad's son comes out of his room, Toad uses the threat of the Big Bad Wolf to scare him back inside. Bigby doesn't even need to be present for his past to actually do damage. His old identity follows him into every interaction whether he wants to or not. Upstairs, Bigby walks into the heart of the conflict, and that's the woodsman beating Faith. And immediately the woodsman does what almost everyone does. He drags the past into the present. He reminds Bigby of who he used to be. He also reminds him that in their old fairy tale life, the woodsman killed him, cut him open, filled his stomach with rocks, and threw him into a river. The confrontation isn't just physical on the surface, but it's historic. That fight follows is brutal. It's a bloody mess and uncomfortably violent. The woodsman gets his jaw broken, and Bigby doesn't hold back. This is a brutal fight and not a superhero brawl. It's raw and ugly, and reinforcing that violence is still very much a part of who Bigby is. When that fight sends them crashing out the window, Bigby lands on Toad's car and completely destroys it. And that little detail matters, because this car is never repaired, and that means that Fabletown never ends up helping Toad recover from that loss, even though that was something that Fabletown unintentionally projected. It's a subtle but powerful reinforcement of the same theme, that being the system Bigby works for does not protect those who can't afford it. That moment quietly foreshadows Toad's eventual fate later in the story. Back on the street, the woodsman tries to choke Bigby, trying to literally force the big bad wolf back out of him. And for a moment, we see it in his eyes. Bigby does tap into that wolfish brutality, but the fight is ultimately ended when Faith intervenes, striking the woodsman in the back of the head with his own axe. Afterwards, Bigby shifts immediately back into his role as the sheriff. He asks questions. He tries to gather information. Faith refuses for now, but she makes an offhand remark that everyone knows Bigby lives in the smallest apartment in the woodlands and that she'll come see him later that night. That detail is quietly devastating, because Bigby lives among the elite of Fabletown, but he's still kept at arm's length. He's allowed to exist there, but only as the sheriff and the enforcer. And then Faith says something that lingers.
Hey. I need to tell you something.
What is it?
You're not as bad as everyone says you are. I'll see you around, Wolf.
Bigby is left standing alone, once again bathed in contrasting light. The buildings behind him glow blue, which symbols goodness, order, and possibility. But the red light still shines across his body. He isn't there yet. He's not redeemed. But the potential is there. And Faith helps him see that. This opening scene perfectly establishes Bigby Wolf as an enforcer. He's also violent when he needs to be. And his past still defines how others see him, whether he likes it or not. And yet beneath all of that, there's a genuine desire to help, to be better, even if he's trapped in a role that constantly pulls him back towards who he used to be. Now, the interrogation scene at the beginning of episode 2 puts Bigby in what is essentially an impossible position to grow from. And that's exactly why it works so well for his character. Up to this point, Bigby has been violent, but that violence has always felt situational. In the opening scene, it's reactive. It's about stopping immediate harm. Here, though, Bigby is asked to make a choice for the first time. The game directly challenges him to decide whether violence is something he falls back on instinctively, or is it something he can consciously restrain. What makes this scene hit so hard is Bigby's emotional state going into it. As far as he knows, the woman he was beginning to care about, Faith, has just been brutally murdered, her head left on the doorstep of the Woodlands, which is a place that's supposed to represent safety, order, and protection, and suddenly that illusion collapses. And then after a grueling day of investigating, the person who he really does care about, that being Snow White, has her head appear on the doorstep that same day. Earlier in the story, we're shown that the system fails those at the bottom, characters like Toad. But now it even seems like the higher class fables aren't safe anymore either. The system Bigby enforces doesn't feel flawed, it feels broken now. And Bigby is forced to confront that failure while emotionally raw, angry, and grieving. The interrogation gives the player two suspects, either the woodsman or Tweedledee, and more importantly, it gives Bigby two paths. He can give in to his anger and use violence to extract information, or he can try to show restraint and trust a system that has already failed him. What complicates this even further is the presence of Fabletown's leadership. Snow White, while assumed to be dead, is still in the back of Bigby's head, and she represents the version of the establishment that wants reform. She believes Bigby can be better. She pushes him towards restraint, towards accountability, towards doing things the right way, even when it's harder. In contrast, Bluebeard is there physically present, and he represents the establishment as it actually operates. He encourages violence. He encourages Bigby to let the wolf out and to get results by any means necessary. To Bluebeard, justice isn't about morality, it's just about efficiency. Bigby is caught between these two visions of power, both coming from the same system he works for. And then the scene pulls its most effective move. No matter which choices you end up making, whether you beat the prisoner, clash with Bluebeard or Crane, or try to keep things under control, Snow White suddenly appears alive. It's a genuine shock. Up until this moment, Bigby believed she was dead, and immediately she challenges what you've just done. And ultimately, she tells Bigby it was wrong. That moment is crucial. Snow doesn't just return to the story, she returns as a moral mirror for Bigby. She holds Bigby accountable even when he thought there was no one left to hold him to that standard. And that forces him to confront the idea that doing the right thing isn't conditional. It doesn't disappear just because the world feels unfair or broken. The scene pushes Bigby towards growth. even if the player resists it. Even if you choose violence, Snow's presence reframes that choice as a failure, not just of the system, but of Bigby himself. And in doing so, the game makes one thing clear. Bigby's struggle isn't just about him catching a killer. It's about whether he believes he can become more than what the world expects him to be, even when it hurts. The anti-Greenleaf scene is where Bigby's growth stops being performative and starts becoming internal. This is the moment where his restraint is no longer something he's doing for Snow White, but something he's choosing on his own. What's interesting here is that Bigby and Snow begin to subtly switch roles. By this point, Snow has been deeply shaken. She learned that Crane was stalking her, someone used her image through a glamour without her consent, her sense of safety and control have been violated, and her growing frustration is completely understandable. But that trauma begins to harden her. She becomes more impatient, more accusatory, and less sympathetic, especially towards those at the bottom of the system. Bigby, meanwhile, shows restraint. When they arrive at Greenleaf's home, Bigby treats the child who answers the door with kindness and patience. Though it is later revealed to be Auntie Greenleaf herself just using a glamour, his calmness isn't strategic or intimidating, it's genuine. And depending on how the player behaves, Greenleaf's perception of Bigby actually shifts. She sees him as something other than the monster he's known as. The contrast between Bigby and Snow becomes very sharp once Greenleaf is revealed. Snow is frustrated by delays and feeling like she's losing control. She then demands that Bigby destroy the tree Greenleaf uses to make illegal glamours. And on paper, she's absolutely right. The glamours are illegal. Destroying the tree would be enforcing the law. But in reality, destroying that tree would take everything away from Greenleaf. It wouldn't just punish her, it would erase her means of survival. And that's the difference between justice and cruelty. What's striking is that Snow, who once pushed Bigby toward restraint, is now asking him to commit an act of total destruction in the name of the rules. That is what prolonged exposure to power and trauma does. It narrows empathy and replaces moral doubt with moral certainty. On a deeper level, the scene also quietly challenges the player. If the player has used violence against criminals earlier because they broke the rules, then why is Snow wrong to demand violence now? And if the player refuses her, are they being principled or hypocritical? The game doesn't answer that question, but it lets it linger. Ultimately, this scene shows Snow slipping deeper into the system she once tried to reform, while Bigby begins to change independently. He no longer needs Snow to define what's right for him, and he's starting to do that himself. And that's the unresolved tension about authority, violence, and who gets to decide. And that sets the stage for what comes next perfectly. The Bloody Mary confrontation is my favorite scene in The Wolf Among Us, because it says so little and yet communicates everything the game has been building. By this point in the story, Bigby Wolf has changed. He's gone from being an enforcer of the law to someone trying to enforce justice. He's moved away from using violence to create order and toward creating order first and resorting to violence only when there's no option left. And that's exactly why Bloody Mary matters. Bloody Mary is Bigby's dark mirror. Where Bigby has learned restraint, Mary has none. Where Bigby treats violence as a last resort, Mary treats it as the answer, and the only answer. She doesn't just use fear as a tool, but she thrives on it. Her power comes entirely from people being afraid of her. The fight itself reinforces this contrast visually and narratively. Bigby confronts her first as himself, then the man-wolf, and then the full werewolf. And finally, the big bad wolf emerges. But the meaning of that transformation is different now. Bigby isn't unleashing violence to enforce authority. He's using violence to protect people. Because if he doesn't, Bloody Mary remains the enforcer of the elites, which is a weapon used to keep everyone else in line. What makes this confrontation even more powerful is that Bloody Mary isn't just a mirror for Bigby, but she's a mirror for the player. If your version of Bigby has relied on intimidation, brutality, and fear, if violence has been your default solution, then this fight isn't a dark reflection at all. It's a direct reflection. You've been enforcing rules for a corrupt system. using the reputation of the big bad wolf to keep people in check, no different than Bloody Mary herself. In that sense, Bloody Mary isn't just opposing Bigby, she's exposing him. The fight ends with Bigby defeating Bloody Mary, but what that victory means is deliberately ambiguous. On one hand, it can be read as proof that violence tempered by restraint is stronger than violence fueled by fear. But on the other hand, it raises an uncomfortable possibility, and that Bigby can never truly escape who he was. That the big bad wolf is still the final answer when things get dire, and that ambiguity is the point. Because this is where Bigby's arc really ends. It doesn't end at the Crooked Man trial. That scene reflects your choices as the player. Bigby's personal journey concludes here, in his confrontation with Bloody Mary, where he's forced to face the worst version of himself and decide what kind of power he's willing to wield. Whether that victory represents growth or resignation, that's left for the player to decide. Bigby Wolf is a deeply complicated character. One whose arc isn't necessarily fixed, but it's shaped by choice, depending on how you play him. Bigby either grows or proves that change is something he can only perform but not sustain. And while the better path often looks like restraint over violence, what makes Bigby compelling isn't that the answer is obvious. Rather, it's that the question never fully goes away. Across 4 key scenes, we see Bigby confront his past, his role in the system, and the kind of power he's willing to use. Sometimes he succeeds, and sometimes he doesn't. And that uncertainty is what makes him feel real. Bigby isn't a clean redemption story. He's a character constantly negotiating with who he used to be. The Wolf Among Us simply doesn't work without a protagonist this layered. Bigby's depth, his contradictions, and his moral tensions are what give the story weight. And honestly, characters like this feel increasingly rare in modern media. We don't get many protagonists who are allowed to be this messy, this unresolved, and this human. I hope this video did Bigby Wolf justice. If you enjoyed it, let me know your favorite Bigby moment in the comments, and I'll see you in the next video.